Alright, hello everybody. My name is Darcy Moss. I'm a fifth year student majoring in landscape architecture and city and regional planning. And my ARTA project is looking at gender mainstreaming tactics in Vienna. And if you haven't heard of the term gender mainstreaming before, it's basically a global strategy in both public policy and planning with the goal of increasing gender equality. Vienna is one of the cities that's known for pioneering this sort of concept, and they've divided it into 5 main pillars, which are gender-sensitive language, gender-sensitive data collection, equal access and utilization of services, equally involved in decision-making, and equal treatment integrated into steering processes, for example, budgeting. So I'm going to begin by talking about the history of gender mainstreaming a little bit and just providing some context, and then I'm going to go into some of the projects that I visited. Okay, so I'm going to start by talking about Eva Kehl, who was an urban planner in Vienna in the 80s and the 90s, and she's still an urban planner there today. And she had an exhibit in 1991 titled Who Owns Public Space? So in this exhibit, it was kind of an accumulation of some research that she had been doing for the past 5 or so years. Part of the exhibit included a photography exhibit following 8 women in Vienna and just taking pictures following their daily lives. Just a couple that I had bullet points. I didn't write down every photograph and every map, partially because there was some difficulty with archiving the exhibit, which we'll talk about later. But some of the women featured were a housewife, a woman in a wheelchair, a divorced nurse with 2 kids, a woman with Turkish origins. And this was kind of the closest they got to any sort of intersectional feminism. I think mainly because gender mainstreaming was successful because it was really supported by politicians who up until the late 90s in Vienna were mostly described as white, middle class with Austrian background. So the exhibit had the photographs as mentioned. The one on the right is looking at women crossing the street. This exhibit prompted some data collection where they found that women with strollers took an additional 10 seconds to cross the street compared to what the signage allowed, the time constraints. And then the top left is a protest where women were advocating for easier access to use the train system. Following the exhibit, there was also data collection about how girls use parks differently, and they found that after the age of 9 or so, compared to boys, girls use the parks way less, and that influenced later designs. And then, as I mentioned briefly, there was some issues with the archival work. Nobody was really paying attention except for more leftist organizations. So this is a picture of Radio Orange, which is an independent radio station that was created after the Austrian broadcasting monopoly fell after the Cold War in the 80s. But because of the nature of their work, which faced a lot of censorship issues, the broadcast wasn't saved, and really the only way to access the exhibit now is through just personal anecdotes of the women who are involved in making it. Okay, now talking about my projects. So Rumenplatz was one of the parks that was redesigned following Eva Kehl's exhibit in the 90s, using some of the information that they had collected following the exhibit. So, for example, they found that women are more likely to be pedestrians, are more likely to use public transit, and they're more likely to use it to go to multiple stops rather than just like one singular destination. So Rumenplatz is a park in the pilot district, which is where they used, or where they focused like a lot of their designs that they were testing out. In the middle, you can see there was increased like facilities just for like bikes and strollers. The top right is like one of the entrances. It's kind of inconsistent. One of like the main focuses of gender mainstreaming is accessibility, and a lot of the park was raised by stairs with like no ramp to access. I thought they did a really good job of dividing the space with plantings. Following one of the, I guess, like data points that they collected, which was that women are more likely to use parks if they're more like split up into like smaller spaces. If it's just like one large space, that it's less likely to be used by women. So I think they use planting as a good way of creating like sort of rooms within the park. The top picture is showing how we can access. It's kind of just like, melts into the street. And there's also a train station and a lot of like little pockets of like where people can play. Like for example, like that water feature. This is just showing some more ways that the park is used. There was a lot of people when I was there. There was some sort of like meditation band going on. A lot of kids playing on scooters. A lot of these very small like pocket parks almost throughout. And in this project, they didn't have like many fences. This was a stage in the park that was specifically redesigned following feedback from like elementary age students. They just like, gave their feedback on how they would use the space more, and they were able to work with the planners to create this stage for like their performances and anything like musically related they wanted to do. When I was there wasn't any events going on, but there were some people like chalking in front of it. This was another project that followed Ava Kill's 91 exhibit. It is a public housing project that was designed only by women architects, like 8 or so, and they had the goals of just basically having gender mainstreaming as their #1 priority while they were designing. It was pretty big, a lot of open spaces, but also like once you like got into it, there was like more private spaces, a lot more fences than the earlier park, which I think was partially just because of the time period it was constructed. This was constructed more in the 90s, the other one was more in the thousands. Again, there was like some inconsistencies with accessibility where sometimes there'd be ramps, but there were like some levels where like the only way you can get to them is stairs. A lot of bike parking, and then some narrow spaces that didn't feel like they aligned with gender mainstreaming goals because it's like there is no feeling of safety when you're in like that small but confined space. I'm looking at the bottom right. And then this is the third project I went to. This is one of the first projects that was done in the pilot district. Some photos of the basketball court that was really well used. It was also used as a soccer court. A photo at night, which you can't really tell on the screen, but it was really well lit and there were still people there and it was still like an active space. There were also several transit options nearby. And similarly, there were like the little pockets of play, which I think was more effective than having just like one giant park. And then I was looking at gender mainstreaming just through the streetscapes. I saw the bike system was okay, like better than Columbus, but not as good as the rest of Europe. And from when I was talking to people in Vienna who used it, they had some complaints as well. Similar to America though, where some people were like, oh, there needs to be more parking, which I thought was funny. This is more like in the suburbs of Vienna, but the like bus stops, sometimes they had like benches and like a cover, sometimes they were just like those signs. There was a lot of plantings in the streets as well though. It was a like very green city and a lot of space for bikes, even if the bike lanes themselves weren't as great as they could have been. Okay, that's all I have. Hopefully I didn't go over time.
Oh no, I don't need to print up. I just want like to look at it while I present.
Okay. Why don't you, I don't know how you want to match this.
Just go like that.
By the way, this is.
Hello everyone, my name is Sophia. I'm a spring 2025 graduate of the Bachelor of CRP program. This is my ARTA project, Parks, Plazas, and Protests. My project kind of examines how public space functions during protest and how design, regulation, and enforcement can shape that collective action. I visited Rome, Paris, and Dublin. 3 cities with very different relationships with protests and public space. I will focus on my overarching observations from each city and what they kind of reveal about public space and how it supports or limits civic expression. And I apologize, sometimes it's vague because this was a long trip in a short presentation. So we'll start off with Rome. In Rome, the dominant themes that I observed were surveillance, control, and hostile design. The images shown here are Piazza San Giovanni, a major historical protest site in Rome. What immediately kind of stood out to me was the heavy presence of police, fencing, and kind of defensive architecture, such as like boulders and cement barricades. Even when no protest was really taking place while I was there, the space still felt pretty tightly controlled. I was able to actually speak with one of the police officers stationed here, and he told me that, quote, the area is much better now, which that comment kind of suggested to me that the current level of security that exists here now is specifically because of the site's protest history, which I thought was pretty interesting. This approach to public space has pretty deep historical roots in Rome. Spaces like the Colosseum seen here were designated to manage these large populations through spectacle and control. Today, that logic seems to persist through surveillance, policing, and design choices that regulate how people gather and move about public space. Overall, Rome demonstrated to me how public space can exist physically, but still be kind of limited as a platform of protest and expression. Even like historically significant plazas felt more managed than expressive, suggesting that public expression is kind of permitted only within tight boundaries. So yeah, moving on to Paris. Paris definitely presented a sharp contrast from Rome. While I was there, protest was pretty embedded into everyday life. These images here show Place de la République, during an environmental demonstration. It was centered around pesticides and agriculture. Over the course of that single day, I observed climbers scaling the statue of Mary Ann. I observed organizers leading chants, seated discussion groups, sign making, and even 2 other entirely different demonstrations occurring all at once in the same plaza. I also learned that Paris has a specialized police force that plays a pretty visible role in managing these kinds of demonstrations, but their presence felt a little more focused on coordination rather than suppression, especially when compared to Rome. What kind of stood out to me most was how the space encouraged interaction. I spoke with one of the demonstration organizers. Her name was Hayet. She explained to me that these large, visible public spaces naturally draw people in, which is a big goal of theirs. While organizing can happen privately, occupying a big, prominent space like this allows a movement's message to spread through visibility and conversation. Also, the pedestrian-oriented design of it made this kind of engagement feel a lot more natural. And secondly, I observed an ocean protection demonstration. They were really able to utilize the space to speak for the message in itself, which was pretty interesting. The demonstration hosted drummers, which you can kind of see in the middle of that picture-ish. There was a large water feature in the middle of the plaza. There were large murals that kind of were already bringing people into the space. And even outside of organized demonstrations, protest was almost unavoidable. On the way to the airport, there was a taxi strike, which caused major traffic delays, which was pretty ironic. So overall, in Paris, public space actively sustains social movements. Protest is definitely normalized there. It's layered and integrated into their daily life, for sure. And then lastly, in Dublin, the theme shifted a bit to subtlety, congregation, and educational engagement. The built environment there seemed to favor smaller scale engagement rather than large occupations. Civic spaces like the area around the GPO are heavily dominated by vehicle traffic, making more mass gathering a bit difficult. This image in the bottom left corner shows a smaller group sharing information about Palestine, and they were able to engage a lot of passerby pretty effectively, but couldn't comfortably accommodate a larger crowd, even if that was their goal. And I noticed this pattern kind of repeated across the city, like more frequent interaction and dialogue, but more so on an intimate scale. Although Dublin does have a strong history of mass protest, these contemporary public spaces appeared better suited for informal gathering and education-like events in parks like Marion Square and St. Stephen's Green, showed here in the middle. I observed a lot of small groups gathering, like students it seemed, and I even walked into a literature festival that was definitely encouraging civic dialogue rather than demonstration or protest. One big key takeaway from Dublin was how everyday civic engagement occurs in more different, quieter, and distributed spaces, while larger protests historically tend to shift into the streets when mass participation is more necessary for a message. And in conclusion, across all 3 of these cities, I observed distinct relationships between public space and protest. In Rome, public space felt more controlled and restrained, with design and enforcement limiting that collective expression. Paris demonstrated to me how large, more flexible and visible spaces can actively support social movements and normalize protests as part of daily life. Dublin highlighted to me how design can encourage more subtle, organic, and informal engagement rather than consistent mass demonstrations. And overall, this project reinforced to me that public space is definitely never neutral. Design, policing, history, and culture all can shape how and whether or not collective action is able to take place. Thank you.
Oops. You were there somewhere. That's real good.
Hi everyone, my name is Darren Daly and I'm in my 4th year of the Landscape Architecture program. In May, I traveled to Japan to research the correlation between memory and recovery within the landscape in cities impacted by the 2011 Great East Japan earthquake and tsunami. Although I missed Japan's cherry blossom season, I was still immersed in a country defined by a beautiful and expansive mountain landscape. These mountains are not only visually striking, they are physical evidence that Japan rests on unstable ground. The country lies within one of the most tectonically active regions on Earth and is therefore highly prone to earthquakes and tsunamis. One of Japan's most catastrophic earthquakes occurred in 1896, known as the Meiji Sanriku earthquake. It produced a tsunami that reached 38 meters, or about 125 feet, claiming 22,066 lives and destroying 8,891 homes. It happened again in 1933. And on March 11, 2011, Japan was struck by a magnitude 9 earthquake, producing a tsunami with waves reaching 40 meters, or about 133 feet. More than 20,000 lives were lost, with many still missing. Additionally, the tsunami caused the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant to overheat and shut down, leading to contamination of the ocean. This event is regarded as the worst nuclear disaster since Chernobyl and is the most devastating natural disaster in Japan's modern history. Throughout Japan's coastal regions, mountains have long served as places of refuge and protection during tsunamis. As I traveled through these towns, I encountered stone tablets inscribed with warnings. Messages created hundreds of years ago by people trying to protect future generations. I found these markers deeply moving. Shrines and temples are commonly found within the mountains and hold a powerful duality. They are places of spiritual worship while also functioning as physical sanctuaries. This is just one example of how memory is embedded within the landscape and carried across generations. One question followed me throughout my travels. What guides Japan to live in harmony with the land, ocean, and the sky? In Ishinomaki, what was once a vibrant coastal town has since transformed into a largely industrial area. Residential construction is no longer permitted along the waterfront due to safety concerns. Ishinomaki also experienced a deeply tragic event when an elementary school adjacent to the mountainside failed to evacuate students to higher ground due to disagreements over evacuation protocols. This tragedy reinforced the importance of education, preparedness, and remembrance. The school is preserved as a memorial museum displaying photographs of students, scenes of daily life before the disaster, and footage from March 11. Every visitor I encountered had tears in their eyes as they read messages from parents, teachers, and neighbors. A memorial park and museum were later constructed closer to the shoreline, creating a space for grief, reflection, and peace. As I stood on the seawall, I became utterly terrified of the ocean. Waves crashed violently against tetrapods, the wind was deafening, and the storm was relentless. Since that moment, I have carried both a deeper fear of the ocean and a deeper respect. And I began to question how one could live peacefully in a place like this. Further along the Iwate coastline, I visited Kesenuma, where another damaged school was preserved as a place of memory and education. On March 11, waves nearly inundated the entire structure and the coastline was engulfed in water and debris. While the imagery was terrifying, the landscape just outside the entrance told a different story. Senior citizens were gathered, surprisingly playing mini golf and laughing together. The town understood the importance of designing spaces that restore well-being, even when life can never return to what it once was. The final city I will discuss is Rikuzen Takata, formerly a fishing town of about 19,000 residents. When the tsunami struck, the entire coastline was wiped out. Since 2011, reconstruction has been ongoing with architects from across Japan contributing to the recovery. Kengo Kuma, for example, designed a community center that honors the town's culture and memory while fostering inclusivity. However, the most profound landscape I experienced was the Owate Tsunami Memorial Museum, a place that caused me to reflect deeply on life, identity, and my connection to the landscape. The memorial seamlessly integrates architecture and landscape to honor, educate, and remember the lives lost. A central path extends from the museum towards the seawall, beginning with the water feature that acknowledges both the beauty and destructive power of water. As I walked towards the ocean, I reflected on how it provides life while having the capacity to be dangerous. Despite these thoughts, I felt calm and at peace. An alley of young trees commemorates the forest that was lost and symbolizes resilience and renewal. Beyond the trees, an expansive lawn opens into pollinator gardens, emphasizing regeneration. The final barrier to the ocean is a set of stairs. Climbing them was difficult as I felt the magnitude with every step. But when I reached the top, I was met with a breathtaking view of the ocean, the healing pine forest, the expansive seawall. This memorial profoundly impacted me through its contemplative design and deep respect for natural forces. The ocean, I learned, is a force to live in harmony with, not against. Along the coast stands a single tree known as the miracle pine tree, the only pine to survive the tsunami. It has become a symbol of resilience, perseverance, and hope for a better tomorrow. Earthquakes and tsunamis are inevitable. Seawalls cannot fully stop the ocean from moving. Inland, water will surge upstream, fires will ignite, homes will burn, and lives will be lost. Nothing can fully stop the natural forces of our planet. What I learned is that we must learn to live peacefully with these forces. Our connection to the earth can empower us to protect one another. And in Japan, life has tremendous value. Everything is life. The plants, the air, the animals, and each other. Everything we interact with carries humanity. After this trip, life became more precious to me than ever before, and I was told by many people throughout Japan that living is the most important thing we can do. We must educate, we must remember, we must pass on our memories, we must do everything we can for ourselves and for each other so that we can survive and live. So the landscape becomes a place of community, kinship, kindness, a place where memory allows us to grieve, love, and smile. It becomes a place of peace, resilience, and perseverance. It becomes a place of identity and pride, and ultimately becomes a place that makes us want to live. So I want to thank the Columbus Foundation for making this trip possible, and the Knowlton faculty for encouraging me to pursue research since the beginning of my time here as a student. I learned a great deal about myself, my interests, and I'm eager for what awaits me in the future. Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. All right. Hi, everyone. My name's Mara. I am a third year landscape architecture with a landscape architecture major and a minor in city and regional planning. So my subject is placemaking within limited green space, so documenting LA's impromptu gardens.
So to begin, every time I would go to visit LA, I was struck by the way residents carved out space for themselves, establishing the relationship within nature, within a city that is so sprawling and car dependent. The contrast between built environment and movements and moments of green space became especially meaningful. So, and then the question became, how do residents find green space equity and inclusion in a crowded metropolitan? And this is where I proposed investigating and documenting purposeful activities by individuals seeking to build connection with their landscape. So there's a criteria of shared moments within a public setting, ephemeral, DIY, low cost of materials, spontaneous, and by that I mean perishable and unexpected. So a little bit about LA at a glance. It has a population of 3.8 million within the city, and in LA County there are 10 million people. So there is about 3.3 acres of green space per 1,000 residents. So there are very clear delineations between private and public, and because I moved through the landscape via walking, biking, and public transit, many of these spaces were more apparent than if I was in a car. And so these are some of the areas that I explored. I would hear of a site via word of mouth, and my methodology for data collection was strategic conversations, a lot of Google Earth, non-participant observation, and I would record these moments via drawing, collecting of like little items, photography, and writing. So to go into the small moments, I began noticing patterns of connection within these small moments. They seemed to be fulfilling a need for connection with one's surroundings and became a refuge for everyday life. So this is a slide of those collections of small moments. So it was anywhere from a chair that had been moved to a lawn or a repurposed planter. So some of the moments that really stuck out, were like Curtis Street stairs. So this was one man's efforts that became a collective action, turning into a trellis pop-up garden. So there was irrigation, there were native plantings, there were patio, there was lots of patio furniture for people to come and rest at, and neighbors would come here in the mornings and the evenings to gather and to enjoy each other's company. So another example is the LA River. So along the LA River bike path, one can find like a lot of benches that were brought along the river itself or along the bike path, and there were many guerrilla flower gardens along with like small mementos. So another site is Elephant Hill. So Elephant Hill was one of those sites that lived in limbo of private-public space and was openly used by residents. Many of these sites live within that precarious ownership and were forced to transform every couple of months. But the residents would continually return to claim a section of the site for themselves and to leave traces of memory. So the conclusion, or if I can say conclusion, or my observations, was that this suggests a powerful framework for urban greening. Rather than relying solely on large municipal parks or formal infrastructures, cities might explore transformation by simply making small parcels of public land available. Individual citizens given permission and access become agents of change, and their collective action creates the green city that institutional planning alone cannot. And so with that, I would like to thank the Columbus Foundation and folks that helped me along the way and that spent their time like giving me tours of different sites. So thank you.
Sorry, does anyone know the command? Thank you. There we go, thanks. Hi, my name is Diana Etienne. I'm a fourth year studying architecture. This past year, I traveled abroad to investigate the role of soundscapes in two historically linked cities, Paris and Istanbul. My goal was to understand how sound can offer information on memory, urban life, and culture in which visuals alone cannot do. For reference, in this presentation, soundscapes specifically refer to the acoustic environments of a place that are perceived by humans. Architecture and landscapes are never silent. Every space has an acoustic presence that shapes how we perceive and emotionally habit that space. And this may raise the question, why soundscapes? I first became intrigued in how humans are increasingly losing the ability to focus. We are constantly distracted by digital screens and mass-produced media with little control over the rapid technological advancements contributing to this. Architecture in cities reflect this growing tension through algorithmic and efficiency-driven design. Technology has enabled cities to grow taller and more efficient. However, mass-produced complexes and communities utilizing standardized low-cost construction have often sacrificed human experiences and cultural connections. Architecture, therefore, is following patterns of passive consumption. As a result, the future risks losing human experiences that are central to design. In a world dominated by visual overload and constant distraction, I began to question whether architecture's reliance on visual form alone is enough. Rather than relying solely on the physical and visual qualities of design, I turned to soundscapes because sound cannot be paused, scrolled past, or ignored without presence. It demands attention, revealing patterns of daily life and carrying cultural memory. These ideas are reflected in the works of Marie Schaefer, Usuru Ruiz-Arana, and Peter Zumthor, whose research on sound, atmosphere, and sensory perception informed my methodology. I traveled to Istanbul and Paris, collecting audio files and decibel levels across a variety of urban spaces. Here are maps of each city with Paris on the left and Istanbul on the right, with in pink highlighting where I collected sonic information. And to collect information on the auditory landscapes of each city, I recorded audio files and used a handheld recorder marking decibel levels at each site. In addition, I documented emotional cues and behavioral changes associated with different sonic environments. So the sites visited are historically and culturally significant, but also included everyday locations such as streets, markets, plazas, places of worship, and transportation hubs. Each space offered unique auditory landscape experiences, and I began to notice patterns that visuals alone cannot convey. For instance, in Istanbul, the call to prayer guides movements and social interactions throughout the day. Even in the busiest of ports, when the call to prayer began, people went silent and music was turned off, reflecting the power of auditory signals in shaping cultural and human interactions in spaces. In contrast, in Paris, cultural values are clearly heard throughout the week due to the Code du Travail, which is essentially like kind of their week, like work days, I guess, and how they have like time off. But because of that, loud volumes of traffic and movement dominated roads and transportation hubs during weekdays. On weekends, however, there's an eerie silence along many streets,
and parks became the loudest spaces in cities, speaking volumes about social rhythms and leisure. So after returning from fieldwork, I worked to translate these auditory experiences into connections between memory and visualizations of each city through sound. On-site documentation was revisited while listening to recordings in order to highlight noise sources and identify sound marks in each city, asking how these sounds can alter the experiences of each space. And the most notable condition of auditory landscapes was people and their interactions with their surroundings. For instance, how they moved through buildings, lingered in cafes and alleys, and used space as like a transitional environment. And these recordings were arranged randomly and listened to blindly. So I didn't listen to the recordings knowing where it came from each city, but it was very clear which city each recording belonged to regardless. And this was due to what I found eventually was multisensory integration. So when a sound is repeatedly experienced with specific cities or environments, it kind of becomes linked to our visual and emotions from memory. So sound essentially amplifies the vividness and longevity of spatial experiences, allowing listeners to mentally re-enter a place. And architecture similarly evokes these powerful emotions through sound by carefully designed acoustics, making a space feel solemn, exciting, playful, or even unsettling. I developed a comparative analysis of Paris and Istanbul using sound marks and recorded audios to determine how they can be visually represented and how they inform urban culture. For reference, Istanbul and Paris are not directly connected cities today, but historically they were connected through the Orient Express. So there's this interesting relation on how something many centuries ago can still be informative of how the cities can relate due to something other than visual environments. So I found that the highest and densest decibel levels in both cities occur near water sources, regardless of the related programs. In abstracted yet informative maps, we can begin to see patterns of sound density and activity emerge. Certain sound types, such as signals, keynotes, and archetypal sounds, shaped over time by the landscape and history, reflect how people interacted within each space. In both cities, the public lingered most around active spaces near the water and transit, revealing a strong reliance on movement and gathering with the highest decibel levels there. Community engagement was also highly concentrated in Istanbul around mosques and small cafes used primarily by local residents. Paris's sonic landscape can be identified through metro sounds, the clinking of silverware along street-side cafes, occasional music playing, police sirens, and bicycle tires. By listening to environments, we gain insight into how spaces are remembered, inhabited, and culturally defined. Sound reminds us that architecture is not only seen, but experienced through human presence. This research has reshaped the way I value design, encouraging me to observe closely how people experience and interact with spaces for a future of sensible design. And finally, thank you all for joining me today, and thank you to the Columbus Foundation and Knowlton for this opportunity. It was really rewarding to kind of approach design from an unconventional lens. Thank you.
Hello everyone, my name is Danielle Crittenden, and today I will be presenting on my ARTA project, which was focused on placemaking efforts in the country of Cyprus. So to start out, I just want to recap kind of my research question and method. So I was particularly interested in looking at how placemaking efforts can be influenced by the cultural and economic differences in different places. I landed on northern and southern Cyprus since it's such a culturally different kind of country. There's a UN buffer zone that separates the two sections, and you can just see a lot of contrast there. So I wanted to look at each side of the country. To do that, I chose 3 cities that I thought kind of exemplified the culture in each of the places. In southern Cyprus, I looked at the city of Limassol. And in northern Cyprus, I looked at Kyrenia. And then Nicosia is a very unique city. It's located right on the border, so it has a portion that is in the north and a portion in the south. So I kind of looked at both of those sides almost as their own cities. And then within each city, I chose 2 locations. I tried my best to keep it pretty consistent between the 2 places. So I tried to pick one that was kind of a park and one that was a plaza. And I was able to do this for pretty much every city except for northern Nicosia, which I'll get into in a little bit. At each of the locations, I looked at them twice a day. So I was observing in kind of the early afternoon, like noon to 1 p.m. sort of situation, and then in the evening. And then to observe each of the places, I would start out by walking around the site, taking photos, taking stock of all of the assets that each place had to offer. And then I kind of looked at demographics, what kind of people were using the space, men versus women, children versus adults, people with kids, if people were coming alone or with others. And then I was also looking at the kinds of activities that people were doing and how long they would stay in the space. A disclaimer I did want to mention is all of the sites that I chose, I had to be able to access on my own. So most are located within the historic downtown of each of the cities, places that were pretty accessible for me to go to by walking. So the first city that I looked at was in Limassol, which is located along the southern coast of Cyprus. And the 2 site locations that I chose to look at were the Molos Promenade and Sarıkulu Square. So starting with Molos, this is kind of the main park area in Limassol. It's located right along the coast, so lots of beach access. In terms of amenities, there were public restrooms, lots of places for swim access. There was a skate park, a cafe, art sculpture walk, gym equipment, and a playground. When I was talking to locals in Limassol, they mentioned that this is kind of the main recreational activity space within the whole city. There were also a lot of events hosted here, especially over the summer. When I was there, I saw there was a dance festival going on, as well as a performative art piece where people were kind of encouraging people to lay down and like observe the skyline as it faded into dusk, which was a really cool moment. I noticed that it was popular with all age groups throughout the day, but at night it really took life. That was when those events were hosted, and I saw almost 1,000 visitors in a 1 hour period. And another thing that I noticed is that there were a lot of transportation options, both used in the park and to get there. There was a parking lot, there was shared bike stations, people were rollerblading, they were using scooters, there was a bike lane, so there was a lot of activity and all types of transportation all around. In Sarıkulu Square, this is located more in the center of the historic downtown and is kind of a plaza that was a hub of nightlife, restaurants, and leisure. Here there were also free bathrooms, lots of restaurants, there was an arcade, and even a nightclub. So it really has its own life during the day as well as during the night. And there was also live music at night, which really brought it to life. Similarly with the Molos Promenade, it was more popular at night, although used throughout the day, and you saw a wide range of age groups throughout the day. These are some of the pictures I just wanted to point out. There's some pictures from the dance event that I was able to witness. Something else I noticed about the Molos Promenade is there was a lot of different types of seating, which includes this like bench-like figure that's kind of used for kids. Another thing that I noticed throughout Limassol is there was a lot of street art and political graffiti, which was notably less present when you get to the northern part of Cyprus. The second city that I looked at was southern Nicosia. I looked at Eleftheria Square and Leisure Street. So Eleftheria Square is, again, similar to Molos, it's kind of the main park of southern Nicosia. And when I took the bus into the city, it's kind of the first thing that you see when you get out of the city's central bus station. It also had free bathrooms, cafe, playground, amphitheater, and covered plaza, and was very extensive. I had to pick the central plaza location to study since it was just too extensive for me to look at everything for an hour. This, similar to the Molos Promenade, hosted lots of events. There was a wine festival and like a motorcycle vintage viewing festival while I was there, so lots of things going on. And another thing I noticed is there's definitely a lot of like dynamic aspects of this space, lots of fountains, textured surfaces for kids to walk on. So a lot of kids were having a lot of fun in this park. And then secondly, I looked at Leisure Street, which is the street that kind of leads to one of the most popular crossing points into northern Nicosia. Here as well, there were free bathrooms, restaurants, and there was seating that wasn't necessarily affiliated with the restaurants or cafes. So people would rest here. I saw a lot of tour groups coming through here, and people were crossing the border fairly efficiently. There was never a huge line buildup, but people were crossing pretty much consistently while I was there observing. Some things that I wanted to point out about Southern Nicosia, again, lots of art and different political exhibitions. You can see there's like some sand art here, which I thought was really cool. There's this peace bench that's located literally right next to where the crossing is into northern Nicosia, as well as lots of event spaces. And then looking at this aerial view, which I was able to take from a tower that's kind of in the center of the city, you can see where Leisure Street is going into the border to northern Nicosia. Next, looking at northern Nicosia, I chose to study the North Nicosia Square and Buyukan. So this was the city where I kind of had a little bit of trouble finding a park space. I was actually able to find a park, but when I visited it, there was no one there using it. It was located next to an abandoned construction site, so there was really just not a lot of activity, and it didn't exactly showcase what I was looking for. So I chose to look at these two more dynamic spaces instead. But the park that I did see, it had a lot of amenities and modern equipment. It just wasn't very well used. So the first place is North Nicosia Square. This is a shopping square that's located a couple of blocks north of the crossing. So a lot of the pass-through traffic that I saw through here were people on their way to or from the border crossing. Here, there was lots of shops and also places to sit. I was able to talk to a local who lived in southern Nicosia, and he expressed to me that he was just coming through to do some shopping in northern Nicosia and was heading back. It was clear that he did hold some animosity towards the Northern Republic of Cyprus as a whole, but he still went there to do his shopping. Yeah, and definitely I saw a lot less children here, which makes sense. It wasn't really a recreational space, but still pretty busy. And then secondly, I looked at the Buyukan, which is a kind of shopping area. It's mostly a tourist attraction. The shopkeepers are local, but they told me that most of the people who were visiting their shops were tourists. There were bathrooms, but they were not free. They were manned by someone who was asking for payment. And it was definitely busier during the day when the shops were open. Things started to close when the sun went down. This workout equipment is from the park that I looked at that I decided not to study, but I just wanted to showcase that there was good amenities and equipment. It just wasn't necessarily what I was looking for. And then, yeah, lots of shopping culture that was definitely very present in northern Nicosia. The last city that I looked at was Kyrenia, and the two places that I chose here were Peace Park and Koramboyu Park. Peace Park was a really interesting place because it was definitely a more local park, and it was actually located pretty far from the historic downtown area. I could still walk there, but it was substantially longer than any of the other sites that I visited. There were a lot of amenities here as well. There was bathrooms, a cafe, playground, amphitheater, bounce house, carousel, and there was an animal park with live birds and chickens, as well as an ice cream stand and gym equipment as well. Also, I was lucky enough to be there on a Wednesday, which there's a local market that's hosted just behind the park, so that definitely brought a lot more traffic to the area, locals as well. And what I noticed here was a large amount of children, given that it was a playground and adults there with them. The second location that I looked at was Koramboyu Park, which is located at Kyrenia Harbor, which is another main tourist destination, so that definitely had some impact on the demographics there. Lots of amenities as well, with bathroom, cafe, playground, and seating. Something I noticed here when looking at men versus women is there were definitely more men present, and the area became busier at night as there wasn't a lot of shade along the area that I was looking at during the day. And that's also when there's more vendors that come in, including a balloon vendor and a Turkish ice cream stand. So definitely became more dynamic at night. And then here are just some additional pictures. You can see the amphitheater at the park and the local market. And then show the man taking a picture of his kids kind of shows that there wasn't a lot of shade, so it's not exactly the most comfortable place to be during the day at Kyrenia Harbor. After looking at all of these cities, I came up with three kind of key findings. The first is placemaking design. What I noticed is that Southern Cyprus seems to have more emphasis on spaces that can host events and serve its native population, utilizing more like modern placemaking elements and design, whereas Northern Cyprus leaned more into historical revitalization and creating places that were more catered towards the tourist population. The second was the use of spaces. I found that the public spaces in Southern Cyprus seemed to be more widely used in a variety of ways, and people tended to spend more time there, versus Northern Cyprus, people are more passing through, and if locals are spending time in the space, it might be because they work there rather than visiting. And then thirdly, transportation and access. What I noticed is that all of the cities had some sort of transportation, whether it be formal or informal. In Northern Cyprus, there were definitely a lot more of the like informal bus system, but it did exist. However, I think that there was definitely more of an emphasis towards pedestrian access and pedestrian safety in Southern Cyprus. Especially looking at Limassol, you could see different paths that were designated for biking versus walking, and there just wasn't that much of that in Northern Cyprus. So yeah, those are my three takeaways. Thank you so much. I want to thank the Columbus Foundation and Knowlton. This was an incredible opportunity, and it was just so educational to be able to look at placemaking through this international lens. So thank you.
See you next week.
Hi everyone, I'm Vipul Rao. I'm a third year in the architecture program here, and my project this summer was looking at co-housing. Before I really get into it, I want to start with some acknowledgements. I want to thank the Columbus Foundation and the Knowlton School for having this program. I'd like to thank my faculty advisor, Mohammed Maleh, and I would like to thank all the people who ran these co-housing projects that I'll get into. Something difficult with studying domesticity in architecture is that you want to know what happens, how people live inside the projects, after the sort of building is complete and the photos are taken and posted. And so a large portion of the information I gained off this project was from people who saw my email that said, hey, I live 5,000 miles away and I'm doing a research project. Would you mind giving me a tour? And against all odds, said yes. So I think that's really commendable. I want to acknowledge that before I start. So some context for this project is that, of course, as you're likely aware, the global housing crisis has gotten pretty bad recently. I have some figures here. In Europe, the rents have doubled almost. It's about 1.7 times what they used to be on average just in the past 10 years. And likewise in the US, it's doubled over the past 20 years. There's also been a lot of urbanization throughout the world, with 2007 being the first year where more people across the entire globe lived in cities than in rural areas. And as such, there's been a lot of migration that way, both domestic and international. With that, it means that more people are living farther from home. And so something that I was interested in studying was how co-housing projects could use economies of scale to be more affordable and also serve as a form of social support against this atomization as people move farther from home. And then also looking at how that could structure living spaces beyond the traditional nuclear family. So this definition here is from the Co-Housing Group of America, which is what is co-housing. It is an intentional collaborative neighborhood. It has both private homes and communal spaces, and it can take many forms financially, legally, but what's most important is that the residents have a big say in how the building is run, the governance and the design, and the program. So I traveled to 3 countries, mostly looking around the capital regions, London, Paris, and Berlin. I chose these cities because, as I mentioned, they are the economic and legal capitals of their respective countries. As a result, they've had a lot of migration, both domestic and international. And so the housing markets have become incredibly constrained. I've also chose to look at 3 different countries to get hints of 3 different legal systems, and to see how different funding models that way affect the housing projects which are done. So my first project I looked at was Marmalade Lane. It's in Cambridge. You can see on this plan they have here that it basically consists of 4 different types: row houses, apartments, and another sort of duplex house. And they've basically made a park space and put the buildings all on the periphery of that, with a car-free lane here in the center. So, interesting about this project is that it is almost like a campus of itself. It's an entire neighborhood within the neighborhood. So you can see here they have these communal gardens and some outside space for biking, and as well as a lawn. And that shows you here the row houses, the sort of common area building, and behind these are where they have more apartments. So within the common building, they have many amenities. Some of them were kind of more traditional for apartment buildings, and some I thought were more interesting. They had a small gym space, they had a laundry space, they had a little communal pantry, they had a sort of Fab Lab-esque tool sharing area, and they even had car seats that you could borrow. As they had a car club, you could share cars because this was a bit more of a suburban location. Farther inside the building, they had a shared children's play area, a communal kitchen, a sort of communal lounge where they mentioned that they would show movies at night, and a guest house for visitors of the residents. And something really interesting about all these photos is that everything you see here was furnished by the residents. Was furnished by the residents of this project. So it's all their own property that they've just decided to pull together for the community. Next, I went to France. There were 3 projects here I was looking at: the Ile de Saint-Germain and the Palm Building, which are adaptive reuses of office towers in Paris, and the Commune in Poissy, which is a small town outside of Paris that was designed for single mothers raising children together. I've combined these here because, as you might note from the professional photos, I was not actually able to visit these projects, any of them, as they no longer exist, even though they were only built in 2023 and 2024. And so this was disappointing, but it was also a bit of a surprise, as I was emailing people at Commune, and just about a week before I was supposed to visit, I get an email that they've shut down because they've run out of money. So that was a shock, but it does bring up something important about the sort of disciplinary limits of architecture. These projects can never be more affordable than the land that they sit on. And so you need some sort of, there's a critique there of the current systems of funding and looking at housing as a commodity, that it is often just not going to be the most profitable option. And so they get replaced with co-working spaces without living areas, where they simply close down, or they turn into more traditional apartment buildings, where they can really maximize the rentable square footage. In contrast to that, the previous project in Cambridge had originally been owned by the local government, and they were the ones who started out with the design, and they specifically wanted a co-housing project on that site, which is part of how they were able to keep that and get it built. That is a good segue into my next project, my final project, the Lebensweltvielfalt, which translates to diverse living community. It's in Berlin. It's just 20 minutes out from the city center in the Tempelhof area. It was built in 2020 as well. It's part of sort of a neighborhood revitalization project, because this was formerly an airfield area. And this one's really interesting because although it doesn't look very different from many of the buildings surrounding it, it has a very different program. Where the first 2 projects that I discussed were mainly living spaces with some community areas for the residents, this project is run by it's called the Schwulenberatung Berlin. It's a nonprofit designed to assist for LGBTQ residents of Berlin. And so this building serves as an office space for that organization, as well as a place where they do programs, and on top of that, they have residences. So I have, from the brochure they gave me here, I have a list of all the things that they've got in this building. It is actually the 3rd such building that this organization runs. And they have, 1-bedroom apartments, 2-bedroom apartments, 3 to 4 bedroom apartments. They have a therapy community, a live-in therapy community. They have a live-in care community for intergenerational living. They have 2 daycares. They have 15 employers there. Within the daycare, they have office spaces, and they have these external restaurants. And what's really interesting about that is that it gives them basically many different sources of funding for this project, and it's really a gathering space not just for people who live there, but for anyone who might benefit from the services that this organization provides. So I have some photos here. It's got a lounge, it's got balconies, it's got a communal kitchen, it has the office spaces, and many of the living spaces are just arranged on these kind of typical double-loaded corridors. But what's interesting about how they've done it is that it's not every door behind those corridors is an apartment as you might expect. So for example, the corner office of one of these hallways might be where the therapy occurs, and then the doors next to that are where the people in that program reside. And so we're often in architecture, we have like program diagrams and we'll say everyone lives on this side and then everyone will work on this side. These guys have really intermingled the programs, and it's made it so that many different people doing many different things can cross paths throughout the entire day in the building. And then they've also made these little art installations that were done by the residents of the community to sort of contribute to a sense of place and to variety on each of the different floors in the building. So my key takeaways here, these sort of projects are not a one-size-fits-all solution. They work best when they have specific goals and lifestyles and clients which they're aiming for. Secondly, it always requires a cooperative client. This project in Berlin also was supported by the federal government as well as several nonprofits, donations, and I believe it's the Lotto charity there, the lottery. And so for these projects to really be successful, land can no longer be used as a speculative tool, as an investment. We must reconsider how these projects will be funded. Then finally, I noticed that a lot of these projects were either new construction or office towers. And I think in the future it would be interesting to see how they might adapt existing residential buildings, which there are many of in these city centers, like your typical row houses or the Haussmannian apartment buildings in Paris. That's all I have, thank you.
And that's all we have today. 7 presenters. Shockingly, I think we are within 1 minute of being perfectly on time, which may never have happened before. Great job today. Tomorrow, 6 more presentations starting at 11:30 in the morning. Okay, thanks.